one, so there's not much care where the work ends up. And then also kind of the issue around, it feels like it was a state of panic when he did this, without ever actually thinking what he was doing, right? I'm not sure. But I feel like having to move a history that belongs to us and go put it elsewhere takes it out of context. You know, these are our memories. And then once again, we have people looking at us instead of us talking back. So I think that was my kind of thinking around it, that once again, there's this voyeuristic way that will be looked at without us having any conversation with them.
Yeah, I would follow on to what Candice and Akona both, the points they make in terms of the kind of scrutiny we should have for the content of David Goldblatt's archive. The very fact that here we have a white author of these images, whose avowal for the most part is a documentation of Black lives under the era of apartheid. I think that for me, the trouble I've had with Goldblatt's archive, in a sense, his avowal, is really that I've always felt as though it wasn't created for or had no relative investment in a Black audience. I think a lot of the way that it lives and functions in the world today, the archive itself, is that it is, I would imagine, much more accessible to a more privileged class of a particular race, by living in an institution like UCT. And then secondly, the very content of his work is very much looking at the Black body in a particular way that I find to represent Black bodies as evidentiary presences. So what I mean by that is that the way I read Black bodies in Goldblatt's archive is that they function as elements within the self-declared objectivity of his visual language and style. And I still question how he, as a photographer and a South African citizen of a particular race and class, relates and continues to position himself in relation to these Black bodies as his subject matter.
Okay, thank you. I think to add to that, well, there's two things I'd like to say. The one is I was in an award ceremony at the French Embassy last year, where Goldblatt got a kind of military orders from the French Embassy from the French Ministry of Culture via the French Embassy, and in it after he had been given the medal, he then made a speech, which is also mentioned in one of, he recites an incident where he refused the award of Ikamanga, the orders of Ikamanga. And the reason he gave at the ceremony is that he didn't want to get an award from Jacob Zuma. Fair enough. But it made me question also then, why would he then accept an award from the French? So I think that there's a kind of a double standard involved there. So that's one thing. However, and then also he went on to criticize Fist Must Fall and the kind of burning of the artworks that was involved. Now, of course, when these things are evoked, as some of the articles that we are mentioning now have suggested, is that there is something essentially, it's never stated like categorically, but that there's something in the Fees Must Fall movement, or perhaps I suspect what they really mean in the Black body itself, that is essentially destructive. And therefore that these artworks are not safe in these spaces anymore because Blacks have moved in, basically. So that is the subtext of what I get from these kind of articles. And so my sense, so my sense is that when people invoke this idea of that these institutions, in particular universities, are sacrosanct spaces, what they're actually referring to is not so much the space of ideas, the space of knowledge, but rather the space of privilege, which they feel is being violated. The last point I want to make in relation to this is, and maybe it's actually a question, and is that, okay, so David Goldblatt did establish the Market Photo Workshop. We cannot deny also the contribution that the Market Photo Workshop has made to South African history and photography in South Africa. We can perhaps question the manner in which photography was being taught at a certain stage of the Market Photo Workshop, but still, you know, I remember, for instance, also seeing photographs of Goldblatt teaching photography in Gaborone, having been invited by Medu Arts Ensemble, and all of these kinds of things. So for me, it's like, you know, there's always, when dealing with certain individuals and certain strata of the liberal establishment during apartheid, that on the one hand, there's certain facets of our cultural life or political life that they contributed to, but on the other hand, there is this also problematic history. And for me, it has felt as though we have had to make absolute judgments as to whether they are either villains or heroes. And my personal view is that we can encompass both, and we don't have to choose. But I'd still like to hear what you think. By the way, Omar Bacha, actually, this is also the thing. When I read the article by Omar Bacha, it seems like he's praising David Goldblatt, but on the other hand, I was in another conference where he really took David Goldblatt on, and in particular criticizing his depiction of some Afrikaners, which was interesting because he was Omar Bacha defending Afrikaners. But anyway, so there's this kind of like kaleidoscope of different types of ways in which we can look at Goldblatt. But also, I don't want to dwell too much on Goldblatt. Otherwise, I think we're fetishizing him a bit. But anyway, your opinions on
what exactly?
on how do we have to choose between this hero or villain type of narrative?
So for me, I think that's essentially what photography offers us as a means through which to consider history, is that it's not just one thing. We are quite taken with the ways in which photography is truth, but photography is also a lie. And so photography is duplicitous in that way. And so for me, it's thinking about photography, you always have to work with the paradox and the contradiction. It's not either or, it can't be one or the other. Things have to actually work simultaneously. Yeah.
I think I feel the same way, like you can't choose Uti. Here, this is it and this is it. There's like a place where they both kind of interact, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think our relationship to photography, historically, currently, still remains one where we want to sort of insist on a kind of either a binary that sort of opposes societal relevance of the medium to evidentiary, like an evidentiary agenda or mission in a sense. And I think we're in a moment now where that kind of binary understanding of the good and the bad of photography is problematized by the very often touted as democratization of the tool of photography and the language of photography, right? And growing visual literacy that we can all now sort of, to some extent, take for granted by virtue of the amount of images we consume daily. Yeah, so I think I agree.
Okay, so the next part is of my concern here is, okay, so we have these archives, and they are sitting there, but somebody has got to, primarily the archivist has got to decide. For instance, the article by that you said, Patricia Hayes, says that there's this person who used to work at the Afripix as a secretary, but to me it sounds more like she was an archivist actually, because she decided which photographs were to be kept and which ones were to be returned to the photographers, and she used to put the captions and who took the pictures at the back of the photographs and all of that kind of stuff. So there's the issue of the archivist, the decisions that they make, and on what basis do they make those decisions? That's number one. Number two, even if the archive is there, there's still somebody who, either a researcher or a historian, who comes and then looks at these archives and then tells the story about these archives, what it is that they find in them and what is fascinating, what is important and what is not important. So it's not as though just by their mere presence the archives do something, they don't. There's somebody who still needs to tell the kind of secondary story, or perhaps the story third removed, considering that the photograph is probably already the second story actually, and then the archive is the third story, and maybe the person who tells the story of the archive is the other person now. So, but what I'm trying to get at here is, but then also the story about the archives for me seems to be a bit skewed as well, in the sense that when I was reading the Patricia Hayes article, for instance, I discovered two inaccuracies. One, which is so glaring I can't believe actually it went to print, that Steve Biko died in 1976. And then the other one was, there was an Alf Kumalo image which has got the banner, "They will never kill us all." It says "photographer unknown," and it is not captioned, but we know that that image was taken at the commemoration of the Sharpeville massacre. I think it was in 1985. So not only does the photograph have a caption, it can place it in a specific time and place, but you do know also who the photographer is, and yet right there as well in the article it says "photographer unknown." So there is a problem as well with even when the archive is there, there is still a story of how the story is being told.
Yes. I think what you're raising for me is an even bigger problem of where does photography fit within this larger idea of South African archive. I mean, we here are talking about photography archives like it's a thing, but often photographs get displaced into different kinds of archives, and it's not always that they are of themselves able to have their own kind of space. And because particularly being around some conversations recently around archives, the whole construction of what an archive is gives me sometimes the heebie-jeebies. Recently at WITS there was an Archives and Democracy Symposium that was civil society driven, which was great. But it was because they're trying to think about freeing the apartheid archive. And the whole session, we're just talking about the apartheid archive, the apartheid archive. There was no conversation around photography That wasn't part of it. It was this whole idea of archive as this textual, document-based thing. So where's photography in that? And the second issue, which I think speaks to this idea of not only the archivist, but how are we interpreting archive, is because our history didn't just start during apartheid, right? So there's a way in which we've constructed ideas around our history and archive, which is not even problematizing the language of classification, of race, gender, ethnicity, even geography in our archive. So it actually makes photography, I think, quite vulnerable. Photography is actually quite vulnerable within our archival system currently. So that's what I would say.
I think for me, like personally working with an archive, of course I was commissioned to do this work, and I sort of kind of made the decisions on what, I was the one who was supposed to decide what goes into the archive, what is not seen as the archive. And because I was quite naive, you know, and I was very excited to have access to this man's life, I just put everything in there, his love letters, his family images, you know, because I felt that all of this spoke about this one man, not just snippets of these famous bodies of works that we know. And now there's a third party, which is Imeka, that then start making the decisions with what's shown out there, you know. So, I mean, I just don't know when, you know, when the archivist, well, on my reference, where do I, when did I make the decisions? I didn't make any decisions. I am commissioned, and I do what I have to do, and I get out, and then another person takes it over, and then another person takes it over. So there's this vast there's so many people involved in this one person's work, then a lot of it starts becoming displaced.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting also what Candice problematizes, the fact that do we think of photography as implicit in the history of South Africa? I think about sort of the way in which the story of South Africa sort of is punted in public spheres, right? So you have most recently the rise and fall of apartheid, this seminal traveling exhibition, which did rely quite heavily on photography, historical photography, to tell that very straightforward, linear narrative. And then the irony of that is that it was situated here in Johannesburg at Museum Africa, which houses quite a wealth of historical South African photography that the state itself relies on to tell the story about the national project, right? Of what apartheid was in the current democracy, and how we ought to sort of think around that as a visual marker of this heritage that was meant to value and protect. And so yeah, I mean, the way in which I think inherently as South Africans, the way in which we don't necessarily pay very close attention to how these images that we are ingrained in our collective memory and imaginations are constantly reframed, remixed, information is erased, names of people disappear, years are misconstrued and misstated, places are misnamed, I think is very indicative of this key problem in the question of archive. Yeah.
Can I just add something? I think, Thato, what just kind of came to my head is an issue that I have with how photography is used in telling our history. Because, for example, with Ernest Cole, why are his photographs only used as an illustration of what apartheid was? And we keep using our photographs as illustration. Yeah.
Okay, so which brings me to another point where, for instance, in the Patricia Hayes article again, she references another photo agency, I forget the name, where one of the people who was responsible for selecting the images to send overseas was constantly being told that they want the images of suffering black people. And so, but the interesting question basically, the interesting issue there is that this was an organization that was supposedly fighting apartheid, and in order for them to be able to mobilize the anti-apartheid movement, they had to show the brutality of apartheid in its most grotesque form. And so if images didn't show this kind of brutality, basically, they would be rejected. So that then also says to me that, you know, even what we remember as apartheid, and I'm saying remember in the sense of what is archived, is in itself skewed in favor of the physical brutality of apartheid rather than the systematic, banal, everyday type of apartheid, which is not, perhaps to use a wrong word, sexy enough to put on a newspaper cover.
That's a great point, Kwezi, and it reminds me of a text that Teju Cole, the American photographer writer, recently included in his book. A Picture of Black Skin was the title of the text, and you know, there's a similarity in the way he talks about particular photographers, black photographers, who documented the American civil rights movement in the 60s. So Gordon Parks, and one particular a guy he mentions, Roy de Caravara, who photographed in a very unusual way. The protest action wasn't very dominant in his archive. It wasn't sort of the thing he wanted to focus on, you know. He looked at black skin and photographed it in a very particular way. As a kind of celebration of the black body in the story of the civil rights movement in America. I'd like to, you know, as a kind of a proposition, I'm curious if perhaps in re-looking at the South African archive, we could pursue those kinds of moments that speak of or look in a different way, because what continues to happen is when our story travels abroad to the West globally. Yes, I've confronted that in particular assignments I've taken on with European institutions who are like, can you get me that picture from 1976, or Sharpeville, bodies on the floor. It's incredibly frustrating that I now have to perpetuate the continuing dehumanization of the South African lived experience, right? Black lived experience, in the work that I do with the way that I work with archives, and what has become sort of the go-to cliched understanding of what the visual story of South Africa's history should or ought to look like. Yeah.
For me, I think what's at stake, what you're saying, is how are we defining resistance? Because I think there's a particular way in which it has been defined, visually particularly, and so going ahead and trying to reread these images that were important to imagining and also resisting the kinds of things that we were subjected to. But I think going ahead, we're going to have to redefine what is resistance. The struggle wasn't just violent. It wasn't just, the camera wasn't just a weapon. The camera were other things, which is, and one of the photographers I'm looking at, Cedric Nunn, photographed his family for 30 years outside of the national struggle. And that work has been kept away for a large part and only kind of surfaces after apartheid. So I think there are ways in which black photographers not only worked biographically and was waging their own kind of personal struggle in their lives that wasn't just about the UDF or the ANC at the time. So I think critical to the future is to redefine what is resistance.
I think, you know, there's been a narrative of how the black body has been seen, and we've related to it. We've taken it as, oh, the Hector Peterson image is, the Hector Peterson image is us, you know. And the one thing, I do not want to photograph black bodies in how they've been photographed. I have no interest in photographing a poor person. I have no interest of showing strike images of kids with bullets in them. That stuff happens. I'm over it. And I think the photographers that are photographing now need to give a different narrative. You know.
Okay, thank you very much for your contributions and your thoughts, but it's not over yet. If you give me a chance, I'll talk for hours, but I'll do the proper thing and allow the audience to ask a few questions. Okay, I reckon.